When you think of hygiene in the medieval period, it's easy to imagine the characteristic peasant farmer, knee-deep in cow dung, with black teeth crumbling away in his rotten gums, dirt under his fingernails, greasy hair, an aversion to bathing, and often smelling like poo. And while this is funny, and to some extent true, the reality is that medieval Europe took hygiene pretty seriously. They just had different ideas about what good hygiene was, which led to behaviours that many of us today find kinda gross compared to our modern clean world. And there's no argument from me there, by the way. We know a lot more about hygiene today and have a lot more things to keep ourselves clean with, like mass-produced soap, shower gel, running hot water, underground sewage, and so on. We are cleaner than we've ever been. The World Health Organization defines hygiene as conditions and practices to maintain health and prevent the spread of diseases. And if there's one thing humans have always liked, it's being healthy, disease-free, and most importantly, not dead. Medieval folk were no exception. So, even if it wasn't quite up to our squeaky clean standards, what did hygiene mean to the average medieval European? Let's start the video the way that most of us start our day and take a look at dental hygiene. Teeth. So useful, but historically, quite a pain in the arse. A long time ago, way before the medieval period, for reasons that are far too complicated for me to explain in this video, humans decided to stop being hunter-gatherers and specialise in a brand new game called farming. However, when we made the switch, tooth decay went from a marginal condition that affected about 5% of people to a whopping 30% of folks suffering from crumbling teeth, abscesses, oral infections, and, if you're unlucky, death. Wheat porridge and warm beer replaced a varied diet of fruits, nuts, meats, fibre and veggies, with disastrous consequences for dental health. Farmers had terrible teeth, and let's not forget that most medieval people were farmers. But old problems always have their old remedies, and medieval folk kept up the fight against plaque and periodontitis with a very unique and special tool. This. Yep, with a simple twig and the application of salt, you can get in there and scrape away all the dirt and gunk. I'm not going to try it on camera, sorry to disappoint. If you were especially wealthy though, you might add some ground cloves to the salt for some extra punch. Clove oil, after all, is still a popular home remedy for toothaches to this day. But if you were poor, you could swap out the clove powder for burnt herbs like rosemary. And if you didn't fancy a twig, that classic medieval fabric, wool, was also popular. People would just take a small pad of wool, dip it in the salt mixture and scrape away, not unlike a modern toothbrush today. Teeth decay, by the way, wasn't the only reason that medieval folks kept up with their dental hygiene. There was also a strong belief that bad breath was almost a moral flaw. This sentiment was so strong that there was even a specific word for bad breath, halitosis. And having halitosis was a sign that you were either ill or that you were the source of some other illness that could go on to infect the wider community. In other words, by having bad breath, you were seen as a public health issue and a potential threat to those around you. This is mainly because they had some funny ideas about how diseases spread, believing that they originated not from bacteria or viruses they didn't know about these at the time. They thought they originated from miasma, which is foul smells and bad odours, basically. And in a world without microscopes, that's not as stupid as it sounds. Corpses, poo, and rotting animals can make people very sick, and they also smell terribly. This is why plague doctors have the beaks filled with nice herbs. It's why there was an entire class of people called gong farmers who were employed to collect poo and throw it outside the city walls. And it's why medieval people didn't just stop at brushing their teeth, they also had mouthwash to hide nasty odours within and protect against external miasma. These mouthwashes were pretty simple, often made of vinegar and salt or stale wine with herbs, but enough to quickly swish around and spit out before greeting an associate, or, if you're lucky, stealing a kiss. If you're unlucky though, one of the teeth in your head might start rotting, and when that happens, twigs and salt or sour wine and vinegar would be no match for the stench and agony of a proper infection. Medieval folks might not have known exactly how or why infections spread, but they knew, left alone, that spread they would. Bad teeth had to go, and often, much more painfully, then they came. The process was simple, but brutal. With a set of tools, usually some forceps, the offending tooth would be gripped, and then with a great twist and pull, the root would be torn from the gums, and the tooth would be extracted. I made that sound quite fast. It wasn't fast. Finding the right tooth in a world without proper electric lighting, reliable mirrors, and rather primitive but large clunky tools meant that there was a lot of fumbling about inside the patient's mouth. And then once you'd got your grip, you actually had to get the tooth out. And if anyone has had a tooth extracted, as I have before, they'll know just how much force and leverage is actually required to rip the tooth out of its snug little socket, completely tearing apart the gums surrounding it, and often with a series of sickening cracks and jolts as the tooth gradually comes more and more free. Incredibly painful, especially when the best painkiller available for most folks was nothing more than a strong drink. But hey, anything for that killer smile. Now, we've got our teeth nice and clean, so let's take a look at the next thing on our list: washing and bathing. At first, washing in the medieval period was convenient, pleasant, and probably quite fun, but we'll get to that in a bit. First though, we need to tackle this idea that your average peasant was water averse, hydrophobic. They weren't. The washing of both your hands and face were considered a normal and essential start to the day, with most houses having a basin filled with water so that you could wake up and refresh yourself first thing. Cleanliness was close to godliness after all, and medieval people were very keen on God, to put it mildly. In fact, like nearly all other medieval assumptions about everything from diet to ethics, Christ had his say. And for Christians, water has always held a special significance as a substance that has the powers of both cleanliness and rebirth. For examples of this, please see baptism, a process of coming unto Christ, which of course requires water. In fact, in some academic circles, see E. Clark M's book Contemporary Biology, Concepts and Implications, there are arguments that Christian attitudes towards cleanliness and water are the reason that the bidet, which cleans your bottom with water, is still commonly found in Catholic countries like France, but not in Protestant nations like England, where the ungodly swine prefer to use toilet paper instead of gushing water. I'm not sure how much I agree with Clark here though, as I currently live in Spain, very Catholic, and my partner is Polish, also very Catholic, and in neither country have I ever clapped eyes on a bidet. Although, when I lived in Thailand, which is Buddhist and very much not Catholic, I saw them used in abundance. Expats like to call them the bum gun, and they're great. But the relationship between Buddhism and water is a subject for another day. For today, we're looking at medieval Europe and water, and the conclusion I want to drill home is that they liked water, they cleaned with it regularly, and like today, visible filth on the face and hands was seen as gross. So, fine, they washed their hands, but what about the rest of their body? What about bathing? And here, you would also be wrong. Medieval folks loved a good bath, and a tradition of public baths had been a hangover that stuck after the Romans brought them and then collapsed out of Northern Europe. We even have a town in England called, wait for it, Bath, named after the Roman baths, heated by natural hot springs. Very cleanly. These were relatively popular throughout medieval Europe, where people could go and enjoy a hot bath and socialise with others. Sometimes, however, this socialising went from sizzling conversation to steamy embraces, which I imagine was a good bit of fun. The church, however, did not find this fun and considered bathhouses to be a place of gross indecency. There were clean-up efforts, including some laws in Paris to try and ban prostitutes from hanging in and around the baths, where they could pick up some easy business in the steamy back rooms. It wasn't particularly effective, and bathing remained an activity that was a prelude to sin. In the Penitential of Burchard of Worms, we can actually find a full catalogue of the sins that people got up to whenever men and women bathed together, and it's worth a read. But try as the church might, the offer of hot water for a cheap price was too much to resist. You've got to remember that at this time, if you wanted to have a bath in your own home, you'd need to find the water, collect enough water to bathe in, take that water to your house, then heat it, then find an object big enough for you and all this water to fit inside, and that's a hell of a lot of work. And so it's easy to see why many continue to visit the baths, even if some of the attendees were sometimes sinful. Uncleanliness, after all, was also, in its own way, a sin. And I think, between you and I, we can all agree that for some deviant souls, the sin was part of the appeal. The church wouldn't get its own way on bathing until the Great Plague of the 14th century, when the baths closed for more or less secular reasons. Those reasons being, it was very easy to catch the plague, and congregating with several strangers in a perfect vector like hot water was a fantastic way to get sick and die. The plague eventually, though, left Europe. The public baths never returned. In fact, attitudes towards cleanliness also changed, with some beginning to believe that a layer of dirt on your skin actually served as a protective barrier against infection. But bathing itself didn't die, it just changed. People still used water to wash their bodies, but now at home. Burnt wood ash was commonly added to the water in order to help clean off dirt and soot. Others preferred to use stale urine, which is kind of gross, but was already used in a lot of manufacturing processes, and you can see why they weren't as squeamish about it as we might be, although I'll definitely pass on that one. But one way of washing that has been popular since the beginning of time and remained popular throughout all of this period was washing outdoors, in streams, rivers, and lakes. This was especially attractive in summer, where it offered a chance to escape the heat and avoid the effort of dragging buckets of water home. We know quite a lot about when and where outdoor bathing was popular, because whenever people flocked en masse to rivers and lakes, a small number of them ended up drowning. And we have evidence of their hygiene mishaps in coroner's records. In April 1269, John White, 12 years old, took off his clothes to bath in a stream and, I quote, was drowned by misadventure. Robert de Leer went for a bath in the Wharfe during the 14th century, but entered the water alone, and with no one being present, there was once again an issue with him being, quote, by accident, drowned. But don't be thinking it was just the wicked and wild waters that claimed lives. A 10-year-old boy managed to drown in a marketplace trough as he washed his hands and bowl after eating. So no, washing wasn't uncommon in the medieval period, but it was somehow dangerous. First, it was sinful, then it was a great way to catch the plague, and finally, it was imbued with the risk of drowning. Not totally safe, but still totally popular. Lastly, let's look at some gender-specific hygiene issues, shall we? As always, ladies first, and I'm sure some of the ladies watching have already been asking themselves when we're going to get onto menstrual health. We're not. The official line of medieval Europeans is that you should have some shame, and any and all menstrual blood is cursed and dangerous. This led to a lot of squeamishness about how to deal with menstruation, with many choosing to discreetly come up with home remedies and hygiene strategies that were shared privately between women in their families. Historical records show an almost childish reluctance to document the issue. So, how did women actually make do? Nearly all fabric you can imagine in the medieval world was valuable, and so the idea of a disposable cloth made for this purpose would have been an outrageous expense for the average person. This meant that a lot of women lived in shame for an entire week of each month and relied on natural padding like moss, plant fibres, scraps of wool, and so on to be used. Rags that couldn't be used for any other purpose were probably employed as well, and some historians have suggested that this might be where we get the lovely term on the rag. Sorry girls, for you, this period of history sucked in a lot of ways, and menstruation was one of the hundreds of daily outrages to be quietly endured. Let's lighten up a little bit and turn on to an easier demographic for hygiene: men. There's really only one gender-specific hygiene issue you need to worry about with men: beards. Short answer, they just grew their beards. Shaving was expensive and a barber was beyond the means of most men. Barbers did exist though, and they're the reason barbers still have this sign, because the trade had a second job as well as cutting hair, and that was cutting skin, letting blood. They had sharp tools, and so bloodletting was easy for them to do and was a cheap procedure that was considered to be a kind of cure-all remedy for different kinds of illnesses. The barber's pole that we all recognise today is said to be white and red to show the blood running out of the patient's wound and down the white bleeding pole, a hangover of the medieval origins of the trade. So, yeah, medieval hygiene wasn't perfect, but it was definitely something that they took seriously, for the most part, anyway.